Strengthen your understanding of governance and policy design. The 12-week graduate course in public policy begins 10th January 2026. Apply by 30th November 2025 to avail a 10% early bird scholarship.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Namaskara, and here we are back to another All Things Policy episode. And today I have with me Anisree Suresh, who's a colleague and research analyst at Takshashila. And today we're going to probably look at how we break down the biggest workplace shakeups in India in decades. That's the 2025 labor reform. And yes, the one that has replaced about 29 different labor laws with just 4 big codes. And if you're thinking like me, a person who's been in HR, that it's going to be fewer forms now, maybe we are on the right track. So whether we're thinking about a gig worker, we're talking about employers, or we're talking about founders or HR professionals, or just someone trying to understand what's actually shifted, I think this episode will help us make sense of the noise. So let's dive into the codes and what it means, our rights, and a little bit into the future. Thanks, Ani, for joining me on this episode.
Thank you, Sowmya. Thank you, Sowmya. Really looking forward to this discussion.
Okay. So quickly, Ani, just can you give us a fair idea about, more so give us a context about this?
Yeah. So, Sowmya, if you look at it, like throughout much of the post-independence era, India's labor regulations have resembled a very disordered ecosystem, or especially when it comes to legal infrastructure, right? So it's often characterized by overlapping statutes, like, drafting during various political periods. You have something like certain laws as old as like 1926, like, from
Yes.
the pre-independence era onwards. So each of these statutes were driven by, like, distinct concerns, and oftentimes what happens is like they were in contradiction with one another. So when you look at it from an employer's perspective or an employee's perspective on the overall investment, ecosystem, the applicability of these laws and these overlapping provisions across multiple laws, it has caused certain anxiety among the employers, and it triggered worries about, the compliance, because we, despite the 1991 reforms that we had, labor was one of the sectors that we kept untouched. Right. So that, the regulatory cholesterol was, still existing in the labor ecosystem for a really long time. And we do have a lot of compliance liability related sections in all these laws, and even multinational companies that want to come and invest in India, they who were quite used to specific and clearer compliance requirement, probably at their home jurisdiction, and come to this, and they see very complex and overlapping, contradicting legal system in India. That's been happening for the last 70 years, right? And if you look at it, if you clearly analyze all these labor laws, for over 70 years, India's manufacturing aspirations have been shackled by these, colonial era labor framework that kind of discouraged formal hiring, and it penalized scaling, and you have very criminalization clauses for non-compliances, and it kind of rewarded inefficiency in a way. So the impact was quite undeniable. It suppressed investment, it stunted the job creation in India, and you have an overwhelming informal workforce as part of it. So if you look at it, around 85% to 90% of India's labor force is still in the unorganized sector, and you have 42% of India's population still working in the farm related areas. So that means you have a surplus of labor stuck in these quite unproductive sectors of the economy and not able to move up the ladder as we go, right? So this came out the Indian So in 2020 itself, we saw like kind of a revolution happening with this India's labor laws now being consolidating all the existing laws into 4 new labor codes. So the labor codes consolidated, like you mentioned, 29 existing labor laws into 4 comprehensive codes, basically. So one is wages, one is social
Hmm.
security, one is on industrial relations, and one on occupational safety and health working conditions. So if you look at it, the first code, the wages code, was notified in August 2019, and the remaining 3 codes, like, in September 2020 as well. But it took another 5 years to get into the implementation aspect of it. And, like, November 21st, last month onwards, like, the government said that we'll try to implement these codes as well. And so,
Hmm.
when you look at it, what is the role of union here is like the constitution has categorized labor as a subject in the concurrent list, especially if you look at the entries from 22 to 24,
Right.
which
Huh.
therefore kind of enables, like, the union government and state governments to legislate on the subject. So, and if, like, so the role of states in these labor codes implementation will be high, and we'll come back to that part probably in the later part of this conversation. And one of the context is, like, again, this is not a new thing. In the 1999, I think, the second labor commission was formed, and this is like the second labor commission,
Huh.
which report came out probably in 2001 or 2002, suggested that we have to codify all
Hmm.
these laws into 4 or 5 codes maximum, and we don't need this complex structure that is confusing everyone and all those things. So that's how, like, eventually,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
those recommendations were shelved for a really long time, and finally it came out. And
Yeah.
from a pure economic perspective, is one of the greatest thing that we have done in, like, in terms of, like, probably after the 1991 reforms. This is a one huge reform that we are undertaking to kind of structure our labor force in a way that's beneficial for the economy, beneficial for more job employment. However, like most of the reforms, it's not perfect. Again, we'll come back to those aspects later. It's not perfect, but like a much needed reform in that stage. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, that's like a good premise for us to proceed on this conversation, Andy. So, the 2025 labor codes could be a game changer of sorts, like for our Indian workforce. But can you kind of lay out in terms of what the new codes will bring?
Thanks, Soumya. I think that's like very important aspect of our conversation, right? We have to understand, like, what are the new provision is just simplification of the codes. And okay, before I get into the each code, like, and the new provisions and all those
Hmm.
things, we have to
Hmm.
understand that these 29 laws they converted or codified into 4 codes. So these codes also reduce like some 1,200 sections into just 480 sections,
Hmm.
and around 1,400 rules into just 351, and 84 registers to 8, and 31 returns to just 1, and 8 registers to 1, and 4 licenses to 1. So these
Hmm.
numbers are quite important because, like, the simplification means quite a lot, because India's manufacturing sector spent quite a lot of time in, like, complying with various rules, and oftentimes the non-compliance costs us more than just penalties, and oftentimes it leads to criminalization of those offenses. So that
Hmm.
means, like, the simplification itself is a reform in that sense. Now,
Hmm.
if you want to get into the code on wages, which was, like, again passed in 2019,
Hmm.
it basically consolidates and modernizes India's wage regulations into a single statute. So basically, we had 4 earlier registration. Now it's all subsumed into one code. So its
Okay.
primary objective again is to guarantee fair, timely, and equitable payment to all workers. So
Hmm.
irrespective of the sector or type of the employment. So here, the unorganized sector is very much part of these law code on wages.
Hmm.
So just like couple of new provisions. One is that there is a determination of minimum wages based on skill level and
Yeah.
geographical area.
Hmm.
And this minimum wage is again guaranteed by a lot of things. And there is also a provision of floor wage introduced under the new provisions added to this wage code. So
Hmm.
that basically means the union government will decide what is a floor wage, in which, based on for each skill based or geographical based on a larger floor wage for all the jobs, and then it's up to the state government to keep that as a floor of
Mm.
wages, and then introduces minimum wages based on the, whether it's urban area, whether it's rural area, and based on the skill level they decide and determine the minimum wages. And this one important aspect is like it also guarantees equal remuneration to male and female workers, so
Yeah.
that gender disparity is completely like eliminated at this stage. And it also guarantees timely wage payment, and even the floor wage as well as the minimum wages given by that will be given by the union government and the state governments. So there will be a periodic review of that wages as well. So every 5 years they'll come back again and discuss whether these wages are still relevant or meeting the requirements of the people, and then do the review. I think one aspect that I kind of liked about this code of wages is also the inspector role of inspectors especially. So we had a very physical inspections, random inspections, and paper based inspection. So that's completely moved to a more of a facilitator role here. That
Yeah.
sense it's more digital, and
Yeah.
only based on the risk inspector visits or does the audit and everything, and most of the time it's very digital. And also if an employer is not complying with any particular rules or the regulations mentioned by this code, the inspector will actually give them kind of they help them to facilitate the employer to comply with that law. And only
Yeah.
if there is a repeated offense, repeated non-compliance, then the employer will be provided some kind of penalty in that sense. So
Yeah.
I think that's a very important aspect, because the role of inspector comes more evolves into more of a facilitator role. So that's very interesting. So that's something about the code on wages.
Yeah.
Yeah. And now if you come to the code on social security, which is again amalgamated 9 labor laws into this code. So this is again quite a lot of interesting one for especially the unorganized sector, the gig workers, and the platform workers and all those things. So first of all, there is a benefit of free treatment available under the hospitals and dispensaries under the ESIC scheme. So if the gig workers and everyone in the unorganized sector, if they are able to make a small contribution to the scheme, then they also get the benefit of it.
Yeah.
And then again, pension scheme, EPFO for all workers. And it also mentioned that the state and the union has to create a social security fund. And requirement of minimum service has been removed for payment of gratuity. And also there is a national database creation for the unorganized sectors. And employers employing more than 20 workers has to mandatorily report vacancies online. And all this important factors are involved under this. And I think one important factor is also here that gig workers, platform workers, and fixed term workers are given certain kind of recognition, in the sense they were defined what they are and all those things. So that way you are able to bring them part of the labor force in a proper structural way. Yeah. Yeah, and the industrial relations is also another very interesting code here. So again, it consolidates and amends laws on basically trade unions, retrenchment, industrial disputes, and all those things. So again, here the trade union's role is in a way enhanced as well as limited. For example, at the time of retrenchment, a worker would be provided 15 days wages for reskilling. And if there is any dispute between workers or the employers and everything, it has to be resolved within a year in the tribunal. So that's very interesting, because until now we didn't have a time limit on these dispute resolution. Right now that time limit is given. However, one challenge here would be the state capacity and all those things, but then I think we'll cover that later. And again, all these industrial tribunals to have 2 members to facilitate faster disposal of the cases. And the trade union, in any industrial establishment for that matter, trade union that's having around 51% of votes shall be recognized as the sole negotiating union between any of these disputes that might arise. But if there is no trade union with 50% of the votes, then a mix of all the small trade unions will be brought together, and they constitute the negotiating council in those kind of disputes. And yeah, so every establishment or industrial establishment with 20 or more workers will need to set up one or more, grievance redressal
Yeah.
committees for resolution and all those things. Now, the last code, the Occupational Safety, Health and Working Condition, it amalgamated almost 13 laws into like one code. So here again, one very interesting is like the definition given to interstate migrant workers, and they are very much added as part of this code. So earlier, if you look at it, only workers appointed by a contractor were recognized as interstate migrant workers. So only if like a contractor who has probably like 10 plus interstate migrant workers working under him, and only if he registers them, then they get the recognition as an interstate migrant workers. But under these new provisions of this code, workers can now register themselves as interstate migrant workers on the national portal. So this is very important because then that will help them to get a lot of benefits, especially ration benefits and all kind of like benefits into it's a portal for all of them to get these kind of accessible to various schemes and all those kind of things. And yeah, there are quite a lot of interesting codes again under this code as well. One is they again have to create a national database for interstate migrant workers. And most important fact, this is like quite funny how this law has existed for a while. That is like under the factory law, the previous factory law, we had like women were completely prohibited working in factories around from I think 7 p.m. at night to morning 6 a.m. So the
Yeah.
night shift was
Thanks.
completely banned or prohibited for women, and that's like surprising. So now that has been completely removed, but given the condition that women can work, like women have given the right to work in factories and establishment if they had given the consent, and also the employer is providing the necessary safety conditions for women to work.
Yeah, I'm hoping this kinds of amplifies our women labor force participation
Yes.
rates as well, right? I mean, we talk
Yeah.
about it so much, something is enabling, hopefully, in the right direction, right?
Yeah.
Um, Ani, some more questions on this. As much as it seems like a lot of consolidation has happened in this process and it's enabling in nature, I feel there's a lot of pushback as well, right? So, what are the challenges or the kind of debates that's been going around?
Yeah, so challenges, especially looking at it from a pure economical perspective again, Samya. So one is that if you look at it, there is one law that says that previous law that said that factories with 100 or more workers needed the government's permission before they could lay off employees and close that company. Okay, so this has what it has led it has completely limited the firm's option to look at scalability, look at more exports and all those kind of thing, because they had to keep the limit of 99 is the maximum number that I will have of employees, so that I don't have to face these kind of compliance issues. But now they increased to 300, so
Hmm.
scalability of firms is an option. But again, from a very economic perspective, as we're looking at sustained economic growth, especially in the context of the US tariffs and everything. And the world around us is going into a more protectionist stance, right? So in that context, 300 is still not enough. We have to look at how we can encourage the smaller firms and the newer players that's coming into the industries, manufacturing sectors and everything, to look at it and see how can we scale it much, much larger in a way that it so the productivity has to go on. So I don't think we should have any kind of clauses that limits the scalability of firms. So these kind of the regulatory cholesterol really limits the scalability of the employers, right?
Hmm.
And then again, there is also one rule that says that maximum 8 hours under the occupational safety and health working conditions, maximum 8 hours per day for 6 days in a week. That's the maximum working hours being given there. And employer will also have to pay for overtime work done by any worker at twice the rate of wages. So
Hmm.
this again, okay, while you have to build a balance between healthy working conditions and everything, we
Hmm.
also have to look at this creates certain kind of economic unintended consequences in the way that it limits the firm's productivity in a sense, and that affects the overall productivity of the economy. So that's again not a good economical posture to have. Then, if you look at a lot of complaints from the trade unions, the protests and everything, they have raised certain concerns about the floor wage being set by the union government and everything. And the concerns of the trade unions might be different, but again, like you have to look at what is the market. Oftentimes when you look at it from a pure economic sense, any kind of price caps or price floors
Yeah.
often doesn't work well, right? So if you look at it in the wage also, that might affect how the employers look at wages from a pure skill based or pure merit based system. So that again probably would have a lot of unintended consequences. Then again, like we said, the women's security aspect, women's safety aspect, in the sense that you putting the onus right now, okay, women are allowed to work, but the employer has to meet certain condition. Again, the onus is completely shifted to the employer. However, I want from completely banning to allowing them to work, although with certain conditions. I think it's a really great step, but I'm like, it can be improved a lot. It this is not an ideal situation, but still like a middle ground that we both can be happy about. So in those sense, it's really good. But the challenge going ahead will be to demonstrate political conviction by communicating the importance of this reform to various stakeholders, because you have suddenly this implementation. But again, this is not a very radical move, because in the sense we have been discussing this since the 2002 when the Labor Commission report came out.
Hmm.
So this has been going on, but again, we have to have proper communication with the stakeholders and especially with the states for this matter, because with labor being a concurrent subject, both the center and states had to frame laws and rules, right? So while the parliament cleared these four labor codes in 2019 and 2020, the union pre-published the draft rules for all four codes, and some state governments were lacking in completing this process. Like you still have a lot of states who are not completed or drafted their rules in aligning itself with these four codes. So you have to get the states also on board, because they are the most implementing, they play a critical role in implementing these labor codes and ensuring that this is done in the right way. So you have to get them on board. And so, internal discussions within the central government in 2022 had been contemplated a staggered implementation of the labor codes. So, with the initial rollout of two codes and codes on wages and codes on social security ahead of the general elections last year. So, in the sense, now we have we have said that we'll be start implementing the codes, and probably by April or something, I think the implementation will be in full force. But then again, you have to get all stakeholders on board. But again, that might not be a very practical steps, but I think from a very economic perspective, from looking at how India should be taking off as an economy, this is quite important step in reforming that.
Yeah. In fact, I think this is like the big leap, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like my own tenure about 20 years back in the corporate HR meant, completely negotiating on all fronts, right? Like you are never in a phase where you're compliant 100%, because if you comply with one law, you realize that you're actually non-compliant with something else.
Yes.
Like I remember the kind of things that the Shops and Establishments Act had was like have spittoons in the stairway, or things like, of course, the shifts is a huge problem, because, like you said, safety also has to be accounted for, right? And
Yeah.
that means cost, and that also means additional manpower, because there was a time when the BPO industry in Bangalore was booming in a way that every cab had to have like a woman officer also inside when they're getting dropped late in the evenings. And just looking at safety meant like somebody is actually taking that responsibility, right? So there's a lot of moving parts to these things, and we always question how India is not optimizing with technology in terms of saying, okay, why Vietnam and other places are actually able to kind of propel their manufacturing segment, is because they're probably working round the clock, right? And having enabled a system that allows for these things. So I'm only hoping with these kinds of conversations there will be some promise and hope to kind of make the systems move to a more, a direction where the workers, employers, and the broader economy is kind of pushing for reforms, right? So, are there any closing comments from your side, Ani?
Yeah, just like I want to highlight one thing, like I said, like it's again not a perfect reform, but again it's a significant step towards and tackling our labor laws to revitalize the investment spirits here, especially in terms of looking at it from like three perspectives: decriminalization, deregulation, and digitization. I think on these three perspectives, it has done a really good job. Especially you had a lot of for non-compliance, like again I mentioned earlier, a lot of criminalization was like you were you could have get imprisoned if you not comply with certain. So this code kind of decriminalizes 65 sections that weaponizes thousands of compliances, right? Instead of that, what they did is like they increase the penalties. They also offer something called compounding of offenses, which allows you to like settle things outside the court. And yeah, I think in terms of that, and also in the number of forms companies had to fill in this regard in terms of complying with various rules, that have now reduced from 180 to 73. And the most important fact again is like it expands social security and all these benefits to gig and like unorganized workers, removed all these unfair restrictions on women. And I think it kind of also enabled a certain kind of portability of benefits for industry and migrant workers. So I think this is quite important when you want to see that how we want to take off your economy into the next level. So I think like I'm quite happy with the codes as of now, but again we can still take further steps to improve the ecosystem to ensure that we get more investment, especially at a time that we really need it. So I think this is a good step in that way.
Yeah. Thanks, Ani, for this quick conversation about everything that this whole reforms has to offer. And I think for us, being a country which is so massive and diverse, right, and ever evolving, with these new codes, at least we're trying to fix decades of some patchy systems that were like big real problems that people could never figure out how to go about it, right? So
Yeah.
there is something that's coming our way. But like all big reforms, I also think the impact of these also depends on, like, say, how states implement them, or how companies adapt, and how also workers understand their rights, right?
Yes.
Like, of informal sector don't even know, like, these things should probably move through a route of educating them that this is what you can do about stuff, right? Because
Yeah.
up until now they haven't even had it. So I think we should keep watching how this rolls out, how the promises and of course the impact of everyday work will look like. But yeah, until then, we'll all stay informed and of course stay curious and keep this conversation going. So I, Sowmya Prabhakar, will sign off and see you in the next episode. Thank you so much, Ani, for your time and inputs.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.